Great, thanks, George. Thank you, everyone, for being part of our conversation today. I am going to take a minute here to share my PowerPoint slides here with you. So hold on one second while we make that happen. Let's see. Trends. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that title slide.
Looks great.
Very good, thank you. So, so what we're going to talk about today is just sort of like some sort of high-level-ish trends and issues that we see taking shape nationally around financial aid and affordability for independent schools, and then and what kind of sort of implications they tend to have on schools overall from a leadership perspective in terms of what school leaders like yourselves should be doing to understand and unpack some of these issues at your own school level. And then I'm going to sort of also overview some trend data on financial aid investment and admissions activity, enrollment numbers, and things like that, specific to the New York schools in New York, both in the city as well as schools outside the city. Kind of have set it up in a couple different ways. I think scanning the attendees list, I don't think we have a whole lot of people from schools in the city proper, in New York City itself. So, so when we get to that area, we'll make sure to sort of make sure you understand how to look at the slides so you can kind of differentiate the trends that we're seeing statewide versus those that we're seeing specifically in schools right in and very close in to New York City. So hopefully at the end of this conversation, you'll have a better sense for sort of how to contextualize your own school level conversations around affordability and affordability topic. I know that it's a very busy time of year right now for a lot of schools in terms of making or finalizing admissions decisions and financial aid decisions. And so this is a good time to start thinking about, by the end of the financial aid cycle in particular for this year, what can we learn and what should we be looking at to kind of gauge whether or not our marketplace, or to gauge how our marketplace is responding to their perceptions or their realities when it comes to their ability to afford our tuitions. And so hopefully, again, that you'll end this webinar with a little bit of a better idea of the kinds of data you might be looking for, the kinds of questions you might be teeing up, the kind of resources or tools that might be out there that can help you make your conversations about affordability, I think, more productive and more informed. Don't hesitate at any time as I go through. I'm happy to take your questions as we go along. If I don't hear any as we go through, I will definitely stop at least 2 or 3 times at certain transitional points to see if we have any questions teed up, and I'll be happy to answer those as best I can as we come to those. So one of the things I thought that was interesting about sort of like the affordability landscape question, especially from school leaders, is sort of like it's important to know whether we talk about it or not. It's important to know how people think about your price. And for me, one of the key questions from a leadership perspective around of the affordability and financial aid question is not so much like sort of like, you know, how affordable are we, or do people think we're affordable, or, you know, do we need to offer more or less financial aid? The real important and critical question is, how does our price affect our ability to enroll the class or the students that we want, whether they're new or returning? That's really ultimately what you want to know from a strategic level. To what degree does our price help us or hurt us in enrolling the classes that we want? And if your price affects you negatively, like people think your price is too high so they don't apply or they don't get into the pool, then that means you need to take a certain number of actions to make people believe or understand that through primarily financial aid programs that they may not necessarily have to pay that price, or to make them understand that your school is worth the value, that brings the value that makes that price worth it. as opposed to schools who find that no matter what we charge, we will always have full waiting lists and long lists of people knocking at our doors with or without financial aid. And so the strategies or the way to think about using financial aid or using some affordability questions or markers becomes a little different. I start off with this slide here because I think this is an interesting thing. I'll ask you, if you're not familiar with this, to let me know what you think this is. But this is the snapshot of a person walking down the street in New York City past this series of posters that were just sort of pasted on a wall that show a couple or a few different schools in New York City and what their tuition prices were for this year. I think this actual picture may be about 2 or 3 years old by now. But it's an advertising campaign that is at least a couple years ago, that was a pretty active campaign. So I want you to think about and suggest what you think this is an ad campaign for. And if anybody has any thoughts or ideas, you can either pop them in a chat box or unmute yourself and just kind of shout out what you think. Who's campaigning in a way that showcases tuition prices for the independent schools in New York City? Any thoughts? Who might be doing this? I'm sorry?
I would guess it might be the public schools.
Yeah, I might guess it might be the public schools. Yeah, that comes up often as one of our ideas. But so why do you think it would be the public schools?
Well, because they might be able to show that they're spending less than that and would like taxpayers to provide them with enough revenue to spend something more comparable to this. Or
yep.
Look what a great deal you're getting in the public school because you're not spending this much.
Exactly. So that's one way of how public schools might be talking about private school or independent school pricing. A good idea, but that's not the correct answer. It's not the superintendent of New York City Public Schools. Anybody else have an idea?
Is it a charter school?
A charter school. Why would you think a charter school would talk about or advertise independent school prices like that?
Well, because charter schools are tuition free for the families, and they also need to fill their seats. So they have, it's up to them to make sure they can take as many kids as they're able to take. So
right.
I'd consider a charter school if I was considering a school of 35,000, I guess, if I was a New York City family.
Exactly. And so again, that's one way that a charter school network or a particular charter school might be talking about independent school price. But that's not correct either. Good guess. Anybody else want to hazard a guess? All right, I'll let you off the hook. The right answer is this is actually an ad campaign for, and I hate to be so indelicate, but I think it's very important, for a condom company. And so it's called Sir Richard's Condom Company, and they sort of pose themselves as the luxury condom brand in the market. And so they charge very high costs. I think it's like $15 per condom. And so part of their pitch here is that if you think our condoms are expensive, this is what you'd have in front of you if you had to send your child to an independent school. If you had a child and sent it to an independent school for a year. Exactly. And so this is the way that price is being talked about in some circles, where, and I understand it's kind of probably an extreme example, but but the perception is the price is so high that you're better off not having children. And that's certainly not the kind of message that that we want to be in the public ether about that. And so obviously, if people are talking about your price that way, and if they believe that, then that's clearly going to have an impact on your ability to enroll the students that you want to make to fit your mission and to make your schools whole. And so it is important just to sort of recognize that price is out there. People are talking about in these various ways, not just in how this ad campaign runs and sort of like the rationale behind that, but also like you have mentioned, how public schools might be talking about your price, how charter schools might be talking about your price, how parochial schools might be talking about your price. And all that is one reason why it's important to make sure that families know where they may be able to fit into the spectrum of their ability to afford these prices wherever they fall. So I think the affordability conversation is really about that. How do we get a handle on whether or not our price, to what degree our price affects our ability to enroll the students that we want? And so one of the things I think that's interesting to kind of think about is taking snapshots then of when we're talking about the price. We know that only a certain percentage of families can afford that price. Who is seeking financial aid? To what degree does our price say something about who finds our schools affordable or not? And these are just some national data that I've looked at over the past couple years, just to kind of give a feel for when we talk about financial aid and financial aid applicants. Who are we talking about? What is the sort of like the typical profile of that applicant? And what does that profile suggest about the affordability of our tuitions? And so, so these data just kind of give you a feel for, based on the NEIS financial aid service, the School and Student Services for financial aid. And both of these 2 years, we had about a little more than 150 to 160,000 applications. And when we kind of look at all those applicants and just try to look for the median sort of snapshot for those families and certain characteristics, this is basically who we kind of find as our typical financial aid applicant. Now, we don't have this similar data for our typical admissions applicant, but at least for all the folks that are asking for financial aid, this is what that family looks like. They tend to be, at least by national standards, on the higher end of the income spectrum, $93,000 in 2014-15. We're still crunching our data and cleaning it up to kind of get the 15-16 snapshot, but it'll be somewhat similar. So they're a little on the higher side on the income spectrum than what might be a typical expectation for a financial aid applicant in our schools. They also tend, though, to be very low or relatively low on the net worth side. So they tend to be families that are a little high on income, but not so much on net worth. And the net worth here is really things like home equity, bank accounts, investment savings, and things like that, minus any debts that they have. So they have highest income, lowest net worth, home equity. They have some, but not much. So they're really kind of like cash. One way of thinking about it, tend to be a little bit more on the cash-rich side and on the asset-poor side, which I think is an interesting thing to kind of see. They tend to be around families of 4, and they tend to have 2 children in tuition-charging schools. That's what TCS stands for. So whether that's 2 children in independent schools or private schools, it could be 1 in private schools and 1 in college. And so there are a couple different things there, but they clearly feel a pressure, and one of the reasons why they are in the aid applicant pool is because the typical family has to pay for 2 tuitions, not just 1. Using sort of our rubric and our methodology for financial aid assessment of a family's ability to pay towards tuition, we find that about half, that the median contribution that we tend to calculate is about $8,300. So for a typical family that comes through our financial aid process, they can only pay about $8,300 for tuition. And so when the tuitions are $25,000, $15,000, $35,000, et cetera, the vast majority of people are going to be eligible who apply are going to be eligible for financial aid at a typical school. So this is one thing we think that might be helpful for you to sort of to think about and know in your own school. What is the snapshot of your over time. I think a lot of people sometimes get surprised when they see these numbers because it shows income levels that are higher than than what might be typically thought of for financial aid applicant.
Mark, I think we have a question
here about does net worth include home equity? Yes, it does. So here you see the net worth that says $27,475. that is inclusive of the 14,893 home equity here too. I just kind of separate them out just to kind of give a different look at each of those separately.
Good, thanks.
Sure. So getting a snapshot and understanding that snapshot of who your typical aid applicant can say something about who believes your price is too high for them to pay on their own, and whether or not that profile is shifting over time would be something that's important to check. I'm actually going to stop this chart here. Actually, let me go back to this before I show this these lines move. So one of the other things then is to sort of say, okay, there's a snapshot of it's important to know a snapshot of an applicant and sort of what that might a snapshot of an applicant profile and what that might mean in terms of who's finding that they can afford it or need some help with it. It's another thing to kind of understand why and how that pool might be changing over time. And so one of the things that we wanted to look at, I did this sort of research initially, about five or 6 years ago. I'm just trying to and then just been updating ever since up to that includes the most recent data. To also look at sort of the pace of change over time. So if our typical applicant is changing over time, what are some of the things that are causing that to happen? And so this slide I'm about to show you here is a comparison between how tuition has grown from this period of time, 1980 through to 2014, and it compares it to the rates of growth of families at the median income level, families in the top 20% of income earners and how their average income has changed over the same period of time, families in the top 5% of income earners and how their average income has changed in the same period of time, and also the inflation rate, how has CPI, Consumer Price Index, changed over the same period of time as well. And so as you watch this slide, I'm going to let it play itself out, and then I'll explain to you the various lines and how they relate to each other. The basic gist of this chart is going to show you that up until about the early 2000s, for families at the highest levels of income, their incomes rose at about the same rate as tuition rose for day or for boarding tuition. But starting in about 2004 to 2006 or so, there became this big shift in the growth rate of their income, while the tuition rate has changed at more or less the same pace. And so if you can see here, this red line here shows the change over time in the average income of families in the top 5% of income earners in the country, family incomes. So I wanted to highlight the top 5% because this is typically the slither of families where most schools' full pay families would come from. And so one of the things that this chart shows is that as this red line sort of goes up, if you look at it compared to this light blue line and the orange line, orange is the median tuition at boarding schools, and this light blue line is the median tuition at day schools. You can see that the red line runs pretty similarly to those two lines, which basically meant as your tuition was growing, the incomes for those families was growing at about the same rate. One small little dip here in the early 90s, but for the most part, until about here, 2006, the full pay family at that top 5% level could keep pace with your tuition change. And that meant that they more or less likely, were able to kind of feel that your tuitions were still affordable to them no matter how much they were increasing. So as long as the pace, the rate of change was the same, a family who could pay it back in the 80s could still pay it through 2000. The same is not really true for this darker blue line, which is the top 20% income earners, and the green line, which is the median families in the overall average. So for a much longer period of time, those families have not been able to keep up with tuition growth. And so this is where a lot of the financial aid demand was coming from for schools through the early 2000s. And then financial aid demand started to come more and more from highest income families, this top 5%, when the tuition rate change started to outgrow their income change. So you can see this big gap now between the orange and the blue lines here and the red line. So one of the things we've observed is that a lot of the new financial aid applications that have come into the system, come into our process in the past 10 years or so, has been driven by families earning well over $150,000, $200,000. And so whereas these families used to find it and used to feel that our prices were affordable, now fewer of them feel that way. And so more of them are either dropping into the aid applicant pool, or they are considering other options or other alternatives. Or the other thing that we're seeing is that they're going to be more likely to actually try to push back on your price to ask you if you can give them a better deal, more or less. Let me just back up a little bit and say, it's kind of describe how you read this chart. These numbers on the left side here on the y-axis are really just the sort of the rate of growth. Are not percentage changes. It's just like the rate of growth. So what this basically says is this light blue line, which is the mean, the average day school tuition or day tuition, is about 7.5 times greater in 2014 than it was whatever the first year we looked at. I don't think I had that data all the way back to 1980. It may have started in like 1984 or whatever. So this is 7.5 times higher than it was back here. As opposed to something like the CPI, which is this purple line. CPI is only about just under 3 times greater than it was back in 1980. So while CPI rose by a factor of 3 in this time span, tuitions rose by a factor of about 7.5 times. And again, these two tuition lines grew much faster than any of these income lines, especially the mean income and the top 20% income earners. But most significantly for those top 5% earners, it's a relatively recent phenomenon that they have not been able to keep pace with tuition growth. And so they're becoming more and more pressured to feel that the independent school option may not be affordable to them. Bottom line is tuition changes like it always has, but incomes don't. And so, especially incomes for the highest earning families don't. And so this has created some pressure on where the demand for financial aid is coming from. And this is borne out by our application pool stats. Later purple column or bar, back in 2002, 2003, how the incomes of families who applied for financial aid through our SSS program were distributed by income bands. And so you can see, for example, that of all the applications we received in 2002, 2003, 10% of them were from families earning between $0 to $20,000. And about 6%, 6.4% were from families earning over $150,000. When you fast forward to look at 2014-15 school year, it almost flips, does a 180 in a way. So that only 6.4% of applications for financial aid came from families from 0 to 20,000, and 24% are now coming from families over $150,000. So who is actually seeking financial aid has certainly changed. It's certainly more skewed to the higher side of the income distribution, whereas back 12 years ago or so, it was a little bit more towards the lower income side.
Mark, can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
It'd be interesting to see if that 150,000 was broken out to 170 and 190, as though the whole thing is moving off towards the right.
Yeah, I do have a separate chart that kind of only looks at sort of like the 14-15 year that kind of shows more of that granular. I couldn't do that for this particular slide because back in 2002-03, the largest segment was 150K plus. We didn't break it down more than that because at the time that number was so small. But now with that number being so large, yeah, it is important to kind of see because of that 23.9%, yeah, how does that spread out across, even different, more at a more granular level? I do have that data, just don't have it on this chart, so I can certainly pull that out and share that with you.
Thanks.
Sure.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is it also conclusive to say that the lower income are just not even considering independent schools because to them it's not even a possibility?
Good question. Yeah, we have seen a little bit of slide on that. I wouldn't say it's significant or not like huge numbers, but we are seeing a little bit of a slide, especially in the 20 to 40 range and the 40 to 60 range. There actually are fewer raw numbers of people in the pool in those ranges. Somewhat lesser in the 0 to 20, but not that much. So really, for the lower income side, there is a little bit of that, but it's also mostly driven by the fact that more of the new applications are coming from higher income people. There could be a reasonable conclusion that it's keeping new people on the lower income side from coming into the pool. I think that there's definitely some truth to that. So again, I think this would be something that might be worth, again, sort of looking at the data, your own school's data in this kind of way to be able to see or know if those kinds of shifts are happening at your school and what they may signal or may indicate. Because again, particularly if your school has a purpose for financial aid to build economic diversity or to build access for low-income kids who need opportunities or things like that, when you see realities like this playing out, it could basically beg some different questions about should we be doing something differently, or how do we sort of balance these, what kind of measures can we take to balance these scales out to something that's more aligned to what our mission or our purpose might be.
This may not be quantifiable, but there's been certainly a shift in people thinking that private school tuitions are negotiable at some level, even if they have the money to afford it. I don't know how you would break that down, but how much of that is skewing that it's now in the water that you can negotiate on private school tuition.
Absolutely, I think that's definitely a side effect of the reality that we're seeing on this slide. So as more and more high income or higher income people get into the applicant pool, I do believe that, and we've heard this from schools, that they do feel more, people often use the word entitled. I don't really think entitled is the right word. I just think that they feel more empowered. People at those higher income levels feel more empowered to ask for a better deal, or feel more empowered to think that you may want to take another look at this for me. They may feel like, if I have 2 or 3 offers from some other places, or they have other options that are as, or if not perhaps better than a particular school, then they may feel like they can bargain more. I think there's definitely more, what's the word I want, noise or buzz or news in the popular press about negotiating financial aid packages, mostly geared at, people who are looking at aid for college. But I know every year, Fortune magazine, Forbes magazine, New York Times, U.S. News and World Report, all these outlets put out articles about how to negotiate your aid package. And they don't necessarily give bad advice, but they do put it out there that it's not, you don't necessarily have to take what you got. And I think that higher income families are more likely to feel empowered to push back on that or seek a better deal than lower income families would feel. And under the same circumstances. So yes, that's certainly something that is happening. But I think it's a result of the fact that that feeling of affordability, tuition price growing faster than my income in the past 10 years or so, the fact that I have 2 or 3 kids to try to pay for in private school tuition, all sort of comes into the mix that makes that higher income family part of your pool in a way that they hadn't been before. And so you are going to come across more people who just feel more empowered, feel like they're more empowered negotiators than 10 or 15 years ago. So the other question here about shifts is not just who's applying for financial aid, because anybody can apply, right? Bill Gates could put in an application for financial aid if he wants to. But it's also important to look at, is there a shift, or what's the reality in terms of who's getting financial aid, and what does that signal about the affordability question for our schools? And so this chart shows you a really quick summary of some data that myself and Melvin Roden, who's a colleague of mine here at NEIS, we co-wrote a chapter for the most recent NEIS trend book about the financial aid outlook. And one of the things we wanted to kind of unpack was whether or not it was easy for us to see whether or not who's applying for financial aid is shifting over time. It was a little more challenging for us to know who's receiving financial aid and whether or not that's shifting over time, because our systems are much better at intake than it is in output. So, and we're not always sure about the final awards that schools make for all of their applicants. But we did look at our data, and our system allows schools to track the awards that they make to students. And so we did sort of analyze the award data that is in our system. And we looked at this 5-year period just to kind of see whether or not the families who receive aid today are different from the families who received aid 5 years ago. One of the things that made us want to look at this was because we were hearing from a lot of access organizations, in particular, places like Prep for Prep or Buffalo Prep and ABC, A Better Chance, organizations like that were telling us that it was becoming harder and harder for them to get the big full aid packages for the low-income families that they tend to work with than it's been in the past. So we wanted to kind of see if we could figure out if this was something that was really actually happening or if it was just sort of like isolated sort of one-offs. So the way you read this chart is we looked at, we did the research last year for this year's trend book. So we looked at the time, the most recently available data on income was for 2013. And in 2013, the Census Bureau kind of had these rough markers for the 20 quintile groups of family income earners. So, and those first 5 blue columns at the top on the far left, basically 20% of households in the U.S. fall into each of those income bands. So 20% of the family households earn between $0 to $29,000, and 20% of U.S. households earn over $121,000. So what we wanted to do was to kind of see, and then there's a separate chunk, a subset of that over 121 is the top 5%. So the top 5% income earners were earning over $217,000 for family income. So we wanted to see if all the awards that were tracked in our system, and for each of these years that we studied, we had about 35,000 awards. So it was a large enough sample, we think, to be meaningful and useful. And we wanted to see if all the awards that were in our system, awards that were made for the 2015-16 school year, what percentage of them fell into each of those quintile buckets, basically. So if you look at the 2015-16 column first, it basically says that 9% of the 35,000 awards that were made, 9% of all those awards went to families in the $0 to $29,000 range. And compared to 5 years prior, 2010, 2011, about 12% of all the awards that were made went to families in that same income range. And so what you can see here as you look down this chart, is the percentage point difference in the 5-year period to show that not only are the applicants getting wealthier in terms of a higher income people more prevalent in the applicant pool, but they're also becoming more and more likely to receive the awards. And so, especially at that over 121,000, top 20 percentile, accounted for almost 43% of all the financial aid awards that were tracked in our system were made to families who earned over $121,000. And so, and 11.7% of families earning of awards that were made went to families earning over $217,000. So this slide basically shows that in our recipient pools, or at large, nationally, that the lower income families, especially starting around 51,000 and below, are really underrepresented in the population of the recipient pool. And the highest level, the highest income brackets are overrepresented. So it sort of signals that something about the affordability, or at least the perceived affordability of our schools, where more and more of the financial aid demand is coming from the higher income families, and more of the actual awarding is being made to those families as well. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't get the aid. I'm sure that they are showing a need, especially if they have 2 or more children to tuitions to pay for. But the shift is what's significant here to pay attention to. And does this mean that that the schools in this 5-year period are sort of sliding away from sort of like using financial aid for access for families at the very low income levels, and using it more as tools for affordability and enrollment management for families on that higher income side who could pay a little bit more who could pay a lot more of the tuition. They don't need a full grant. So we have seen that shift happen. We have certainly heard from a lot of schools, especially right in those couple of years right after the recession, about concerns about financial sustainability for schools, concerns about the growth of the explosion of the spending of the financial aid budget and things like that, where it did become more and more common for schools to make certain financial aid and enrollment and admissions decisions based on how much need a family was showing, so that it made more sense from a financial sustainability point of view to spend $25,000 on 5 families in that over 121 bucket than it did to spend the $25,000 on one family in that $0 to $29,000 bucket. We saw a lot of that shift happen, and it still is happening today. But so it is something to think about when you look at your own data in this way. What does it signal about where our dollars are going, and is this the kind of distribution we would expect to see in our financial aid sort of outcomes? So let me pause right now before I dive into sort of what we're seeing at in the New York State Association specifically. Any thoughts or observations or questions? Nope.
Let me
you
just
can
add,
ask a question. Oops, sorry, I was going to explain and you did it yourself. Sorry.
my question has to do with, I guess, sort of motivation or what's behind those dollars. For example, some schools may not have many applicants from the lower income brackets. Other schools may not have many applications from the higher income bracket. It may tell us something about schools' motivation about diversity.
Exactly.
Or as you said, it may be simply schools trying to keep their heads above water. Better to take an almost full pay family and give them $5,000. So it's a variety of things. I assume this slide in itself doesn't tell us anything about what's behind.
Correct. You're absolutely right. It doesn't tell us anything definitive about what's behind it. So at the national level, we can kind of speculate some of those things. And so I pose this as an exercise that I think schools should do individually so that they can, see what that reality actually is. And if there has been a shift, was it a purposeful one? And then I think you can start to unpack. It is much easier at the school level to unpack a little bit more data to kind of help you get a better picture, because you're right. I mean, it could be that we just got no applications in 15, 16. We just didn't get as many applications from families in the $0 to $29,000 range, which then in and of itself suggests something else, right? Well, why didn't we get more applications from those folks? Or what, do we want more applications from those people? How do we go get about to do that? And so you're absolutely right. It's hard to tell at face value sort of what the real drivers and the real dynamics are at play, but there are usually just like 3 or 4 sort of big factors that are probably the key dynamic forces here. And it's important for a school to be able to recognize that and just kind of try to unpack those questions school to school. Absolutely. All right, so let's go on to look at, spend the rest of our time just looking at some of our New York specific data. So one of the things that I think is important for all schools to do when they're talking about having conversations about affordability is to complete this exercise, which we call your affordability range, which basically says, now, whatever your tuition is, you should know how much income a family needs to earn to be able to pay that tuition amount. Just as a marker to start thinking about your affordability posture. So one of the things I've done here is just kind of taken from our NEIS database on tuitions. The median tuitions for schools in the New York State Association at these various grade levels, and day versus boarding. And then using our SSS formula, some really basic sort of assumptions like a 2-parent household, 2 children, only 1 tuition to pay, both parents work. They have, these examples don't include any net worth. To basically just say how much income does a family in that basic kind of scenario need to earn to pay $36,400 of a first grade tuition. And the answer is $226,325. So that's what it takes to be a full pay family at the lowest of the median tuition prices. So from there, you can start, and then it can look go all the way up to the $55,000 median boarding school tuition for ninth grade would require over $300,000 of income to be full pay. The reason why that's important to try to do from an affordability conversation is to then say, well, based on that information, we know that it takes $225,000 to $300,000 to pay some of these tuitions. How many people in our area actually earn that much money? And what is the median income in these areas? And so in New York State, and this is data I got from the NIS Demographic Center, which if you're an NEIS member, both Dazzle and the Demographic Center are available free. And in the New York State, in 2015, only 10% of families earned over $200,000, which is the highest level that that data is cut by. And so we know that fewer than 10% of the families can afford, the typical tuition at least the median level tuitions at New York's NYSAIS schools. Even in the New York metro area, which tends to be wealthier than the state at large, but still only 13.5% of households earn over $200,000. And so, so it's important to kind of know that, because depending on what your price point is and how much it's required to pay it, it's important to know like what kind of market capacity is out there. So if you do this by zip codes or by a ring study, or if you have like a 10-mile radius as your drawing area for families in your school, you can kind of get this data to be able to hone in to know whether or not 2% of the people in your area can really afford that, or 32%, or 52%, or 12%. And where you are on that spectrum can give you a different feel or a different understanding of the degree to which financial aid support or financial aid or other sort of affordability measures might need to be a bigger or smaller part of your strategy, just by looking at the potential for the families to be able to pay the tuition that you have. So this looks at it for the New York State tuitions, but I definitely implore all schools to know this specifically for the different tuition levels that you have at your own school. So that's called the affordability range.
I have a question. Is it
Yes.
safe to say then that if your tuition is a percentage of that the income is then the same percentage?
No, that's not safe to say, at least not based on the way our methodology works. And so, sorry, I forgot to mention like what you can use to do this. So if your school uses our SSS program, we have a software called School Portal. And within the School Portal, we have this tool called the EFC Simulator. And so the EFC Simulator allows you to plug in like different variables and different income levels, different numbers of different family sizes and assets and all these types of things to basically get an estimate or to get a calculation of what our calculation would say, our methodology would say that family can pay. So I would encourage you to use that EFC simulator to be more precise than to say if our tuition was half this number, then the full pay income would be half that number. That kind of doesn't work quite that cleanly. But there are certainly tools you can use for that. And if you don't have that, if you don't have SSS, or if you don't have the School Portal, if you can't access that, I'd be happy to help you, calculate it, here. So if that's something you'd like me to do for you, I'd be happy to do that. You can just send me an email with, 3 or 4 or any number of tuition levels you want to test, and I can calculate that for you. I've done that for a lot of schools.
Thank you.
Sure. So that's the price point, right? So we know that tuitions cost that and what people need to earn to pay it. We know that there are relatively few, 13 or 10% of families, fewer than 10% of the families can actually pay that. And so that's one of the things that will generate financial aid demand, assuming they want to still stay in the pipeline. And so these charts just kind of show a few different ways to think about measuring financial aid demand. And one of the things I've tried to do here was give both a 10-year view of the change in each of these key items, and also a sort of like a pre-recession sort of change rate and a post-recession change rate. So the blue bar that you see there is the overall 10-year change. So number of applications for financial aid among a group of New York schools in the New York State Association grew by about 58% in a 10-year period from 2004-05 to 2014-15. So that's the typical growth in financial aid demand in terms of the numbers of applications that are coming in over that 10-year span. So these are good numbers to try to sort of compare your own realities to, like to what degree is your school seeing growth in financial aid applications relative to what's happening statewide. And this really specifically is schools in the New York State Association outside of New York City. I think my next chart I might have, yeah, so I do the New York City numbers a little differently. So, so the blue bar shows the 10-year change. The red bar shows how much growth there was just in those first 5 years of that period. So the 04-05 to 2009, 2010. So one of the things that's interesting about the number of applications is that there's relatively, little difference between the way applications for financial aid are coming in New York State schools before or after sort of like the worst of the recessionary period. There hasn't been much change. People are still applying for financial aid in about the same rates. I think one of the things that is interesting that you see in the next block of bars here is that the number of students eligible for financial aid has shrunk in the past 5 years compared to the first 5 years of this 10-year period. So in that recessionary period or pre-recessionary period, not only did you get 26% more applications, but you got 32% more people showing eligibility for financial aid. So the people who were applying were really becoming more eligible for aid. And a large part of that was driven by a lot of the changes in people's personal situations and financial situations by the recession. So not only more applications, but more eligibility. As opposed to the last 5 years where even though there's 25% growth in the number of applications, there's only 15% growth in the number of students who are actually showing eligibility. So you're getting more families, presumably on the higher income side, throwing their hat in the ring for some help, and they're just not as likely to be to show eligibility for financial aid as the previous 5 years. Did I hear someone who might wanted to ask a question?
So eligibility is decided by the schools, right? So really this is a marker of them cutting off and saying yes, no?
Correct. So here, yes, we're just taking it based on what the school said that of all their applications, how many were eligible as they determined. So it could be a combination of schools saying, it could be a combination of either the people coming into the pool were just too wealthy. They just didn't qualify for aid, and or that schools were just sort of like perhaps not able to extend aid as much, and so they had to deem more of them ineligible. That certainly could be part of it. And actually that kind of plays out more in this third set of bar charts here, which is actually the number of students who actually end up receiving financial aid. So in that first 5 year period, schools were seeing 25% more students actually getting a financial aid award. And in the last 5 years, they've only seen about 8% more students receiving financial aid. So that could be certainly an indicator of them drawing back on being able to extend aid to more people, and probably a combination of that and just fewer people showing eligibility. So fewer people compared to the previous 5 years really actually needed or ended up getting an award. So it could be both a slowdown in the spending. And so if we want to slow down our spending, we can't sort of keep having 15 or 30% or 25% of the families receiving awards. Or it could be also just wealthier families in the pool not showing as much eligibility. Are any of you from schools like right in or around the city?
Nope.
Yeah, I didn't think so. So I'm not sure.
We are
Okay.
There. Yep.
So one of the things that's interesting is when you look at the just the group of the schools in the city, and New York City met. I picked all the schools that were in a 10-mile radius of basically like Wall Street, more or less, and so. So we kind of see something very, very different here in terms of those patterns in terms of the applications, eligibility, and financial aid recipients. So for schools in the city, they did still see a very marked increase in those first 5 years, like that pre-recessionary period. Those first 5 years of big increase in number of applications, 26%. A big increase in the number of students showing eligibility, 39%. But in the past 5 years, a very, very different, actually they're showing decreases in number of applications for aid and the number of students eligible for aid. And as a result, the numbers of the students receiving financial aid has just been pretty much flat. There's been some negative growth there. So the post-recession reality for schools in the city are very different in terms of financial aid demand than for schools more broadly in the state.
We just want to jump in, Mark, and just mention, just attending to time, that we've got about 4 more minutes in case you wanted to wrap up or ask a final question.
Sure, yeah. Let me just kind of power through a couple more slides here real quick in that regard. So actually I'm going to let's just look at the financial aid investment chart. And so the first one just kind of looked at it in terms of who's applying. Are you getting more demand? Are you getting more eligible students? And are there more or less students receiving aid? This chart actually looks at the amount of dollars that are being spent and sort of, to some degree, juxtaposed against how enrollment's changing. So the total financial aid dollars, again, you can see for schools statewide, the first 5 years of that period, financial aid dollars went up 66%. But in the last 5 years, the total financial aid dollars only went up about 23%. So there was definitely a flattening out or a curbing of the financial aid investment that schools were making, which again, sort of does impact who they would deem eligible or who they would end up ultimately awarding financial aid. However, on the other side of this chart, you can kind of see the income from net tuition revenue, which means the gross tuition that you would receive if everybody paid full tuition minus what you're giving out in financial aid discounts. And in the 04-05 year, even though there was a 66% growth in the number of aid dollars that were spent, there was actually a 50% growth in the net tuition revenue. So it was almost one of those, you gotta spend more money spend more to make more kind of a reality going on there, as opposed to the last 5 years where there was an increase of financial aid dollars of about 23%, but it really only amounted to an increase in the net tuition revenue of less than 1%. And if you can see in that middle block here, when the financial aid investment was stronger, the enrollment went up a little over a tick at 1.4%. And when the financial aid investment sort of declined and the net tuition revenue declined, partially because there was a decline in enrollment in that post-recession period too. So one of the things I think that was interesting here about this chart or seeing these combination of data, although it's hard to sort of make a causality leap between all these factors, but it's interesting to observe that when the financial aid investment was stronger, so was the net tuition revenue and so was the enrollment. When the financial aid investment sort of tapered off somewhat, so did net tuition revenue and so did enrollment. So I think that, I know we're short on time here, so I'll just kind of wrap up and just say that it's these kinds of markers that I think are important to have as dashboard items to think about in terms of your affordability posture and the degree to which the financial aid that you offer and the extent to which you offer it does or doesn't have an impact on your ability to enroll the classes that you want. So think about, and again, I'm happy to send this. I'll send this to George and he can distribute it or you can email me. Happy to send it to you as well. There's some other stuff here we don't have time to cover. But but these are the types of things that might be helpful to think about when you're structuring your conversations about affordability, financial aid, enrollment, and sort of like the evolving nature of demand for financial aid and where it's coming from and who's asking for it, and how do you start to structure your responses to that.